Welcome to Beaconsfield Podcast. It's my first episode after my move to the UK, and there is no one that I would rather be speaking to right now than my current guest, whom I welcome, Dr. Iain McGilchrist. Dr. Iain McGilchrist is a giant of a thinker. He is a psychiatrist, a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, and literary scholar who has produced books like Against Criticism, The Master and His Emissary, and most recently, The Matter with Things. Professor McGilchrist, welcome on.
Thank you very much indeed. Very great pleasure to be here.
I've been engaging with your work for the past 5 to 10 years almost, so it's a great honor to be speaking with you. It's interesting. I guess I'm speaking to you from the place that we both share as a kind of home, Oxford. And in thinking
Yes.
about how I could best prepare for this conversation today, I wondered, should I read more of The Matter with Things, which I've been engaging with very, very seriously and in a much of a fruitful way for a while now, or should I go for a
Yes.
walk through the Christchurch meadows? And I did so listening to Taoist's Lamentations, which I know means quite a bit,
Oh,
to try and get a sense of the enchanted world here in this place, which was, I think, the way into your book and into this conversation.
yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, that's right.
But I might start.
New, yeah, go on.
Yeah, Dr. McGilchrist, I was going to say, what did Oxford do for you as a thinker? How did this place grow you into someone who could create the matter of things as both a work of the intellect, but more as a work of love?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, Oxford played a part, but it was only one thing that played a part. There were other aspects of my education earlier that probably were as important at school. But one of the great things about Oxford was that it enabled me to range more widely than I think would have been possible doing a conventional degree course in many other places. My background is in the humanities, and that to me is extremely important coming to medical science, because a lot of people who are interested in science think of how can I relate this to the world in which I find myself living. If they do so at all, it's a secondary process. Whereas for me, it was almost the other way around. I was very much concerned with the world in which we were living, what that means. And the science that I was encountering helped to open windows and doors in that already formed picture, if you see what I mean. I was also fortunate enough to have a fellowship at All Souls College for 7 years, which allowed me to range very widely in what I did. Nobody was pinning me down to, a paper every few months. And as a result, I was able to grow a much larger project, which I wasn't able to finish then. And I sort of rather wondered if anything would come of it. But really, effectively, the fruit of that has been these two very large books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things.
So what was the sort of longing that you felt in yourself, even as a younger person, that led you to think in this holistic way about the world and meaning? Sir Isaiah Berlin, another All Souls fellow, had that distinction between the hedgehog and the fox, and you strike me, and it'd be interesting
Yes.
to think of yourself too as a hedgehog in that way, someone who seeks
Well,
the gestalt. What do you think?
yes, I think I'd like to think that I'm as much a fox as a hedgehog, in that, in other words, I'm referring to the widespread of my interests. Initially, I went up to Oxford to study theology and philosophy, but for mainly technical reasons, that it wasn't then an honours degree, I was persuaded not to do that. And instead followed the course of the study of literature, and came back to philosophy as soon as I got a fellowship at All Souls. And my philosophy then led me to be interested in the mind-body problem. I found that the philosophers I was engaging with were just far too disembodied in their approach to this issue, and that really it was much more fruitful to become a doctor and to deal with people whose brains or bodies had changed, and this had changed their whole way of thinking and being, their life. And so that was why I pursued this rather long and arduous course, 14 years to become a consultant psychiatrist. And I started 10 years older than most other people on the process. A lot of the young people who were with me sort of said, "Oh, so brave of you to do it at such an age," because I started when I was 28, like, 1 foot in the grave. But it's true, it is a very long haul, and you really are best advised to start fairly early. But I think it was valuable because it made me bring together these things. I argue that nobody should be able in this country. You can't in America actually to start medicine as a degree as soon as you leave school. You need to have done some other first degree, and what I would say is that that first degree should be in the humanities. That everybody should have thought about. Well, the secret is in the name, human beings and their lives and what they mean. So there was a lot of things there. I began to think as a teenager lots of things that were not what I was formally being taught. So that, for example, I believed that the whole is, in fact, more than the sum of the parts. And my sort of clever colleagues peremptorily dismissed this by saying, "So what's this extra something then that gets added in?" And of course, it's not an extra something that gets added in. It's the wholeness that is lost in breaking it up. And I thought that probably extremes met, that if you pushed an argument far enough or a position far enough, you reached its opposite rather than got further away from it. And various other things. I believe the world was not an unresponsive, dead whole, but actually something that resonated and, if you like, in some sense spoke to me, and that I answered to it, and that there was therefore a resonant relationship. So all those things were there really from my mid-teens, and they were expanded. I had a very good tutor who eschewed the fashionable isms of the day, which I'm very grateful for, because if you have a belief that you can apply a certain ism, whatever it may be, to literature, then all you do is pass it through that sausage mill, and out the other end comes predictable sausages.
I've been engaging a bit with your work against criticism this week, actually, and I think this is, as I read it, part of your point, that the critic reads themselves into a book looking to reify and vindicate their own project rather than to engage with the integrity of the whole of the text itself. Would that be the point of that book, you'd say?
Yes, I mean, that can happen, and it was against that I was inveighing. Effectively, I saw works of art of every kind, but particularly I was interested in poems and plays and novels. I saw them as unique, non-explicit. Importantly, most of the meaning was implicit and died as soon as it was decontextualized and made explicit. And that they were also embodied. They weren't just intellectual exercises. They were embodied communications from another embodied being, now often no longer alive, to me as an embodied being. And so the process that we were doing seemed very jejune. We stripped it of its everything except a very simple prose message. We made explicit what needed to remain fruitfully rich and implicit, and we turned something unique into something very general in its nature.
So, what is the story here, Dr. McGilchrist, as to how, at least in the Western world, we arrived at this point? I mean, we might draw in the hemisphere hypothesis here to explore this, but it's interesting because I work on Burke, and when 1789 hits and the French Revolution happens, one of the things that worries him about that crisis point, as he envisages it at the time, writing in the midst of things, is that it's going to destroy the moral imagination. He says our capacity for feeling, for wonder, indeed for love. What are the events? What is the history here of how we got to this point where our world, in every site, the sacred has been replaced by this sort of need for power and control and close manipulation?
I'm sure there are a number of ways of looking at it, and certainly of accounting for it. I don't claim that the hemisphere theory that I've originated, as it were, explains things. It shows us what we're missing. And I think what happened was that in the 18th century, we became arrogant, hubristic. We believed we understood everything and we would have the answers to everything. And unfortunately, the less you know, the more you think you know. And people who know a lot realize how very little they know. I think a bit of that modesty and a bit of awe and wonder would go a long way. We seem to have banished them from our lives, along with a sort of compassionate relationship with whatever it is that exists, including other people, but also the natural world. And indeed, the whole cosmos, if one thinks about what religion gives to us, which is a sense of where we belong and what we are. I think that we've lost entirely the plot, if you like. We no longer have the foggiest idea of what we're doing here, what a human being is, what the world is, how we relate to it. And that can be articulated at some length, which I did in The Master and His Emissary, as a consequence of a shift in our thinking from a balanced use of what each hemisphere tells us to just what one hemisphere tells us, that is the left hemisphere. And as you know, in the second part of The Master and His Emissary, I look at the history of Western civilization from the Greeks to postmodernism. And I suggest that 3 times there has been an era when the two hemispheres flourished well together. And at that time, a great civilization flourished in all respects, in science, in the arts, across the board. But that in each case, eventually, the hubristic, rather shallow left hemisphere came to dominate. Why, you may say, is a good question, and I'll come to it. But first, I should perhaps, just as briefly as possible, say something about hemisphere differences, because there are a lot of people around still, unfortunately, who just know, without having bothered to take a look at the evidence, that there can be no important differences between the hemispheres. This is a typically rigid, old-fashioned, stulted cast of mind, which reeks of the left hemisphere, which is dogmatic and always thinks it's right and knows everything. But in fact, what they know is that what people said about hemisphere differences in the 60s and 70s was almost entirely wrong. And that's perfectly true, that was wrong. But because we got the wrong answers to the question, what are the differences between the hemispheres, doesn't mean that the question is not worthy of being addressed and trying to find a better answer. And that's indeed what I've spent most of my adult life doing. So effectively, we used to say very simple things like the left hemisphere is rational, a little bit dull but reliable, linguistic. The right hemisphere is alien to language but does pictures and is rather prone to emotion. Almost nothing there is true. Well, nothing there actually is true. The left hemisphere is actually much less reliable than the right. The right is much more careful. It's what B.S. Ramachandran, great neuroscientist, calls the devil's advocate, because it's always looking at things from different angles and saying, well, it may not be what the left hemisphere thinks it is. The left hemisphere is prone to jumping to conclusions. A lot of reason is provided by the right hemisphere. A lot of the important parts of language are provided by the right hemisphere, particularly things like the understanding of metaphor, of humor, of irony, of sarcasm, of poetry, of myths, of narratives. All of these are far better understood by the right hemisphere than by the left. So it's not true that the left is the linguistic and the logical one, and the right is the opposite. And the same could be said of emotions. Emotions are very much present in both hemispheres, and the emotion of all emotions that most strongly lateralizes is in fact anger, which lateralizes to the left. So there's a lot there, and putting it briefly, the left hemisphere is interested in control and power. This is for evolutionary reasons. We need to be able to get stuff, mainly food, but also to be able to manipulate things to build, say, a nest if you're a bird, or to make a home for yourself, or shelter, however you do it, as an animal. And to do this, you need to be able to manipulate the world. You need to be able to get hold of it very accurately, quickly, precisely, and do something with something you already know what it is. So it intellectually, it's very simple. It really doesn't go there. It's only interested in use. And that's so important that that whole half of the brain has been more or less given over to that. And the other half of the brain is meanwhile seeing a much more complicated picture, one in which everything is forever changing, interconnected with everything else, is deeply affected by its context, may change its meaning and nature utterly if taken out of context, where things are unique always. They're not just exemplars of a category, as they are to the left hemisphere. And this is an animate world full of meaning, whereas the left hemisphere's world is inanimate and completely meaningless. Now, because I think a civilization tends to overreach itself, and we are no exception to this, there tends to be a reliance on the left hemisphere, the one that's interested in power and control. Because as an empire becomes larger, as the need for stability is something that needs to be, as we say, rolled out, a huge bureaucracy appears, and everything that should be done on a small scale to do with individuals becomes something on a large scale, and effectively simply deals with black and white categories and generalities. We can see this all around us now. There's been an explosion of admin in our lives, and this has been hand in hand with the explosion of AI in our lives. Both of these externalize a simple procedural mechanistic way of thinking, which is typical of the left hemisphere, and yes, helps you grab stuff, but doesn't help you understand what you've grabbed. And at the same time, the one that would tell us what it is that we're doing would help us to understand what we're up to in our lives here. The right hemisphere is relatively neglected. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that means that our brains have radically altered. Of course, they're in evolution, so they do alter all the time, no doubt. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's more like this. You might have a radio set and you're rather interested in a couple of programs. You listen to them over the years, and then little by little you start listening to only one of the programs. And this is particularly apt, actually, in the case of social media, because it's famous that people get trapped in social media bubbles, and they then neglect what other things they could be tuning into. It's not that the capacity to do so has been lost. We can switch it on again at any time.
That's a wonderful explanation. Thank you for that. I mean, I want to talk in a bit about how we can reattend to the world with a right hemispheric view. But before that, I think we need to understand something about metaphor and its relationship with truth and value. Max Weber thought about bureaucracy as a kind of the death of enchantment. To live in the disenchanted world is one way of thinking about that. What is metaphor, Dr. McGilchrist, and how does metaphor relate to truth? How can metaphor be a way into meaning, for example, that we neglect today that we might need to recover as a potential pathway?
Yes, metaphor is terribly important. We think of it as a sort of optional add-on to language that might be useful if one's writing poetry. But actually, metaphor is not at the sort of last stage in language, it's at the very first stage in language. All language is metaphorical in nature. This relates to what we mean when we say we understand something. What that effectively means is, I see it's like something else that I already understand. So it's saying this is like something else. And metaphor is doing exactly that. It's saying this thing can be thought of as like something else. Now, that's something else because it is else, it is other, it is different. Will not be an exact fit, but it will bring to light certain aspects of whatever it is that we're applying the metaphor to. But if we used a different metaphor, other aspects of it would stand forward. So I sometimes say a simple thing like attending a football match, for those who are very keen on this, for some people, it could be a metaphor for going to the betting shop. It's very exciting. You put money on this, and will it win or will it not win? But another way of thinking of it is that it's almost like going to church for some people, that it's a kind of reuniting with some communal entity, the people that you live amongst, and you're seeing something celebrated. So those are two different aspects of an everyday event that, depending on the metaphor you use, look different. And everything looks different depending on the metaphor. And we can't get away from metaphors. Not only does science and philosophy not avoid using metaphor, they are particularly heavily dependent on metaphor. So, for example, the word abstraction comes from a root that literally means dragging something away physically. And so whatever words we use, however they seem to be remote from the everyday, the word immaterial, for example, in itself, it comes from a root meaning mater, mother, which is the mother substance out of which we find the world constituted. So language is always metaphorical, and we need to be thinking about the metaphors we use, because if we use, as we so often do nowadays, the metaphor of the machine as the default to explain everything, including organisms, which are nothing like machines, we misunderstand them.
Exactly, and you speak of this and of how we are not machines, but we are creatures of love. And I mean, this raises that next question: what might it look like to actually reattend to the world with that right hemispheric view, with that capacity for the heart that the right hemisphere offers us? What does that actually look like for us as individuals, you think?
Good question, and all your questions are good. I think what I'd say is you emphasize love right at the start there, and I think that is a necessary part of a certain way of thinking of the world, but it will follow from other things that seem perhaps more accessible to people who don't know quite what they're supposed to do about loving something they feel no love for, if you see what I mean. It has been argued by many great thinkers like Pascal that actually to understand something we need to love it first, which is a hard saying because people feel, well, I need to know what it was first before I can love it. But these two things can't exactly be decoupled, because if you take a very distant and superior view of what you're looking at, you diminish it and you alienate yourself from it, and you see only a certain kind of thing there in the world. Whereas if you practice a more open and generous, I would say, attention without judgments at the start, but instead opening yourself to see what is there, you may have a different awareness of it. One thing I think I like is the idea of what I call active passivity. In other words, not jumping in and doing things and thinking things and forming opinions and talking about them all the time in one's mind, but instead opening oneself to something quietly in a space that gives it somewhere to speak to you rather than you speaking all the time to it. In a way, this is mindfulness. And I'm often asked, do I think mindfulness is a good practice? I do think it's a good practice. And there's plenty of evidence that, incidentally, it does activate the right hemisphere more than the left. In fact, most kinds of meditation, compassion meditation particularly, do. And I think what we're doing there is we're opening ourselves to the reality of the world rather than dealing all the time with a representation of it. This is one of the differences between the world offered us by the right hemisphere and offered us by the left, which I haven't mentioned. A simple way of thinking of it is that the left is rather like a map of the world, and the right is more like the terrain that is mapped.
Yes.
And obviously, there is a vast difference between them. The map is enormously simple, and that's not a criticism of the map. It's a necessity of its functioning. If it had too much in it, we wouldn't be able to use it.
Mm.
On the other hand, we would be fools if we mistook it for the real world and tried to live in the map. However, I believe that's exactly what we're now doing. We have theories, images, diagrams of the world, and we think that is the reality.
Mm.
We think that our two-dimensional display of something is the same as the real lived phenomenon that we experience when we open ourselves to it. So in regaining a right hemisphere attention to the world, one that is not already spoken for, that is not already convinced that it knows exactly what it's dealing with, but instead is actually reaching out, not just saying, well, I don't know, in some blank way, but reaching towards something that already seems to have something about it that calls to us. It's an encounter. Everything important in the world is an encounter between us and whatever it is that exists apart from us. And that encounter, like all encounters, is a two-way process in which both parties are altered. So in this encounter with the world, we are altered and the thing we encounter is altered. You can feel this actually in the way in which one experiences another's gaze. If that gaze is loving and accepting, one feels quite different from if one sees something that is clinically detached and full of scorn. One feels something completely different.
Mm.
And we have become something different. We respond to the way we're attended to, even if it's that we actually have certain responses to that whole experience. And so relationships are like, they are very important. Everything is a relationship. And in a good human relationship of two people who love one another, they don't lose themselves. There's not a sacrifice of self in a good relationship. In fact, there is a fulfillment of the self in that relationship. The person becomes more themselves than they could ever be just on their own by being in that relationship. And so the other party too, if it is a good relationship. So
The
a
image
third
that
thing has come into being. There are the two people and the relationship. In this sense, it's like, where is an electric current? Is it in the positive terminal? No. Is it in the negative terminal? No. Is it in just the space? No. It's in the whole ensemble, the relationship between the two. I'm sorry.
it's a beautiful concept. No, that's beautifully put. I think T.S. Eliot once wrote of Vivian, I can't remember, something of I and you becoming a third, something like that. And,
Mm-hmm.
the image which comes to mind when you say that is of the embrace. You have two separate bodies which united hold each other but maintain their own integrity, creating a new whole or affirming perhaps a whole that was there. And then they can go back to their
Yes.
own ways. And
Yes,
this
indeed.
reminds me,
Enriched.
yeah, this reminds me, Dr. McGilchrist, of the challenge that we face now around dialogue. And I wasn't joking when I walked through the meadows this morning listening to Tallis. The thought struck
Mm.
me that what I'm hearing is the sound of silence in a way.
Mm-hmm.
What that music does is that it opens you up. It reminds me
Mm.
of Simone Weil. You use the word attention. That's one of her words, and she has this wonderful line
Yes.
when she says, "What man needs is silence and warmth. What he is given is an icy pandemonium." And it seems
Mm-hmm.
to me that we live in the disenchanted world of that icy pandemonium, an age in which dialogue in our politics, in our personal lives, in our organizations is made impossible about in the way that we render ourselves abstract to each other. And sorry, I won't go on with this too long, but I've been spending a lot of time back in Australia with Aboriginal people who seem to me to have a deeply unself-conscious understanding of the right brain and of the value of that relational way of being in the world. And what I watched them struggle with was maintaining that living relationship with silence and with each other in the face of that icy pandemonium, which we also ourselves in the West encounter with the death of dialogue. Um, how do you think that we can talk to people from this ethos with this sort of heart when they are not working in the world in that same way? How can the honorable passivity of silence meet the kind of clamor of noise that we see in our public life?
Yes, I'd like to gloss silence in a way. In my first book, before I really had thought these things through, I have a chapter called Speaking Silence, which is actually about how works of art work. They don't have a kind of message, as it were, that I can write down and give to you, but they are nonetheless enormously eloquent about things that are beyond the everyday language. We think that everything should be reducible to the terms of everyday language, but actually it can only take us so far. There are many things that are not encompassable by language, and they tend to be the things that are most important. So we all have the experience, if we've ever been in love, that words are simply inadequate to describe what it is we're experiencing and feeling. It's also true, famously, of the religious sense that what is present in a religion is almost by definition not going to work well in language. And in most of the traditions, there is a warning. Right at the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, the famous mystical tract of Taoism is the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. And there are similar warnings in Hebrew and in the Christian tradition. So the labeling of things is not enough, and we need to be able to get beyond it. How do we do that? I think what we need to do is to open people's eyes to the fact that when they are thinking they've explained it, what they've done is explained something else. They've explained a mental construct of their own. And the question is, how closely does that actually correspond with what it is that is experienced behind it? There is nothing irrational, for example, about music. Music is deeply important, as anyone who has ever explored great music, and you were talking about Tallis's Lamentations, one of the first things that really completely knocked me for six as a young teenager. When I heard it, I thought, I've never heard anything like this. It is unutterably deep and beautiful. And so it's talking, if you like, but it's not saying anything that I can report to you. You have to experience it for yourself. So there's nothing irrational about it, but it is supra-rational. It's above what reason can do, and it's above what reason itself can explain, because there's a lot in it which is spiritual and emotional and intellectual that nonetheless is not accountable for the experience that we have. The experience is not exhausted by any such description. And as I say, all the most important things are like this. So I think what we need to do is to begin, well, what we need to do is the typical left hemisphere's panic, because it wants to be in control. Its whole raison d'etre is control. It's not particularly bothered about anything else as long as it's in control and has power. And one sees this being played out today in large organizations and in the furthering of IT, is that people want power for the sake of power. Just that it can be done is enough, without asking, what is this actually going to be resulting in for human beings? Is it in service to humanity bettering itself, or is it likely to disrupt humanity? And I know what I believe there.
And I mean, one of the last I think it is the last chapter of The Matter with Things, the sense of the sacred. You gesture towards the problems around using the language, or the word rather, God, for describing this silent experience. I wonder if you might reflect on how that word relates to what you've been describing here and to the wider sacred for you.
Well, there's a paradox, as so often when we're dealing with deep truth, as Niels Bohr, the physicist, pointed out.
Yes.
If we have no word and we don't ever refer to it, then there's a chance that God will disappear from our discourse altogether. But the danger is that if we do have a word, such as God, certain people will think that they now have pinned it down. They've got it, they've understood it, they know exactly what it is. But again, there are warnings in all traditions that this word is, if you like, an idol It's something that gets between you and the truly divine. So I spend a lot of time in that chapter at the outset saying, okay, I understand and respect that you may find the word God problematic, so do I, largely because it carries a huge baggage with it. I think I can use it to myself because I have sufficiently purged it, I hope, of that baggage. And so that's part of what it is. I think that I'd say that there is no right way no single right way of coming to recognize the existence of the sacred or the divine. There's only ways that will lead us away, it's true, but there is no single path, there is no formula for it. And once again, I think it's a matter of making ourselves open to something so that it can speak to us. That was certainly my experience. Spending a lot of time in a kind of meditative state, in thinking, and being around places of beauty in nature, and reading poetry that spoke to me about the ineffable. And so it's always been a living thing for me, or at least since my teens, which is interesting because there's no history in my family of an interest in religion, and neither of my parents was religious. I wasn't brought up in a religious way at all. And I'm not sure that even now I'm a very good member of any particular tradition, but I do think this. I think that atheism is a massive error. And I think that there is certainly something, but what it is a matter of a life's journey. And I can't give people a picture of it. It's rather like trying to instruct people in how to swim. You have to get into the water and try.
One of the things that struck me about your chapter was this idea of panentheism, right? The notion that God is not all
Yes,
things, but that God is in all things, and that all things are in God, which implies a relationship, right? A relationship of love.
correct.
What happens when we suffer as a result of disconnect in that relationship? I think of that word lamentation. In its original use, it's used as a word to mourn or long for the absence of the all, and to feel oneself wretched in relationship to that absence. Um, how does lamentation or sadness fit in within the disconnect in that relationship for you and your thinking and feeling?
Well, very powerfully. I mean, of course, the number of Lamentations, beautiful settings of the Lamentations in the 16th century, were responses to what people felt was the destruction of the Church, of the Roman Catholic Church and its tradition in the Reformation. But it speaks very loudly to all of us at all times, and certainly did to me as a young person. There are a number of things to say. I suppose one is that perhaps we all have, as Plato thought, we have a sense of somewhere that we come from, and a sense of missing it, and of longing for that home. The word longing is very important. It doesn't just mean wanting. In fact, I have a lecture somewhere on YouTube on which I gave to a theological college on the difference between wanting and longing. And the word comes from a root in Anglo-Saxon, to stretch out. And it's this sense of being somewhere stretched out from something, not out of touch with it entirely, hence the pain, but feeling removed from it. And this is what Wordsworth also meant in the Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, when he said that, we come trailing clouds of glory from the place where we've originated. And so I think this is in all of us, a sense of somewhere where things do make sense, despite the fact that around us things seem not so much to do so. And I've come to see that what gives sense and meaning and direction and fulfillment to a human life is not so hard to pin down, if you like. there are three very big things that matter enormously. One is our belonging socially, and at the end of the Master and His Hemisphere, I discuss the evidence that people who still belong to functioning communities where they worship together, they trust one another, they are going and coming from one another's houses, they support one another in sickness and health, that in that society, their resistance to not just mental illness, but physical illness was remarkably robust. But in the end of the matter with things, I also look at two other very important relationships. One is with the natural world, and the other is with the divine. And there is a huge body of research on this, and I specify a lot of it in that book. But it is now pretty well established, I would say, that each of these is incredibly important. The relationship with nature and the relationship with the sacred or divine for our human well-being, for our mental health, for our moral health, for our physical health. Yes, our physical health. Belonging to a group who practice rituals of worship or whatever, and it has an effect on physical health alone, which is equivalent to stopping smoking, losing weight, and going to the gym 3 times a week. That's not a good reason for espousing it, because that's the left hemisphere's utilitarian way of thinking of it. But these things are good in themselves, and if we could recapture the sense of things that are good in themselves, not for some ulterior purpose, that would be an enormous step forward. After all, the natural world is not given to us as something to exploit, as resource, as Heidegger would have said. Instead, it is something living, a web of extraordinary complexity and beauty, utterly awe-inspiring, utterly wonderful for us to be gifted this, and to recapture that sense of awe with some degree of humility and some degree of relation that gives us a compassionate attention rather than an exploitative attention would, I think, would solve a lot of, it wouldn't obviously solve a lot of very unfortunate things happening in the world at the moment, but it would start us off on the right foot to do so.
Mm. Is this what you see in the mystic poets? Is this what you see in Blake and Leonard Cohen and Rilke and Rumi? Is the sort of the witness of that longing and the creative fire of it, if you like? Is that what these poets understand that many others, especially analytic philosophers, for example, don't see?
Yes, I think that's right. I may have to demur on Leonard Cohen, but that's just a detail. But but it's certainly what I found in Herbert and Donne and Traherne and Vaughan, and then in even non-sacred poets such as John Clare's extraordinary
Oh, yes.
understanding of the natural world, and then coming to people like Rumi, indeed, and Rilke, absolutely fascinating and completely astonishing um, sources of wisdom about these topics. So yes, it is, but
Mm.
also for me, very much in music, particularly the music of the era that we've been discussing, actually,
Mm.
and and but all music and in and in the visual arts as well.
Mm. It's interesting because I've just, as I was speaking to you on the call before, just started off my first weeks at Oxford, and I'm seeing how easy it would be to allow yourself to move into a sort of left brain space where you choose a narrow topic and zone in and become a specialist, and how uneasy and uncertain and frightening it is to go the other way and to try and develop an ethos. I was wondering how you sustained in your own vocation as a writer and as a thinker the spaces for that right hemispheric way of thinking and feeling and exploring. How did you, were you conscious of the fact that you wanted to maintain that at the front of your mind, or did you, as you sort of alluded to before, fall into it by accident? How does the thinker and the writer find the space for that work today, and how they grow themselves?
I think the word I'd use would be intuition. So it wasn't hard work. It was something that I intuited was profoundly important, and everything else was seen in relation to it.
Mm.
I think one of the things about Oxford that I think is very helpful is the fact that you are in a place where you know that for 1,000 years people have gathered to study and to think and to worship. It's a place that is beautiful. There is a sense of a tradition, if you like, and so you're not asked to make things up from scratch. We would all be very foolish if we had to rely only on what we knew in a vacuum. We build on what has been given us by those who came before us, which doesn't mean we slavishly adhere to a position that was espoused perhaps 100 or several hundred years ago. A tradition is constantly changing. A tradition is a living thing, like a living organism. It is always putting out new branches, new leaves. It is not a fossil. The danger in abandoning it is that you will get stuck in an invention of your own that is both much less rich and actually not alive anyway. And it doesn't have that capacity to change in the way that a tradition does. So if you want to see change, but good change, the kind of change that is not just chucking everything and breaking it and then thinking, well, God, now what do we do? But actually seeing something that evolves, then being in touch with that. I use the word tradition. There isn't another word for it, unfortunately, because in most people's mind nowadays it seems to be a boo word, but it's a shame that it is.
It's
It's
amazing
about
that you say
handing
that,
things on. Yes.
because that's what Burke understood too, right? A state without the means of some change was without the means of its conservation.
He
You
was
know.
an enormously wise man. And what I love is that he emphasized this importance of that we're not just a slice, but we're part of a seamless flow. We have obligations not just to the present, but to those who come after us and to those who came before us. So we are part of a living flow. And in the new book, The Matter with Things, as you know, I have a whole chapter on flow, as well as a whole chapter on time, which I think is misunderstood when we represent it as a series of instants. It is nothing of the kind. It is an organic unfolding.
I wanted to ask you about that because the Blake line which you quote on that, that eternity is in love with the productions of time.
Yes.
I sat with that sentence for days, and it's one of the sentences in a while that's not I've not been able to quite penetrate. What does he mean by this in relation to time?
Gosh. Well, what I say briefly is that it relates to my belief that the cosmos is an unfolding of multiplicity out of unity. So that, as has been seen in many ancient traditions, particularly in the East, in India and China and Japan, the one and the many are aspects of the same thing. And this was something that Goethe also said, that unifying the forces for union with those for the division is the whole process of nature. And if you think about it, a useful image for me is that of an unfurling bud. The bud seems single and encloses enormous potential, but as it unfolds, it is not the destruction of that flower, but the revelation of that flower. It becomes more itself. The integrity of it is not harmed by this multiplicity that is unfolded. Now, I see the whole business of the cosmos. I mean, if one asks, why is there something rather than nothing? And when I address that question in that last chapter, I don't have a simple answer for it, of course. To have such a simple answer would be to misunderstand the question. But nonetheless, there is something here that seems to have a purpose or a drive, and the purpose and the drive that are revealed are those of generating an infinite and unpredictable variety and multiplicity out of a unity that is not in any way jeopardized by that process. And what I think Blake was doing, coming back to the eternity being in love with the productions of time, is that there is this necessary relationship between the two, that the eternal ground of being, whatever we like to call it, God or whatever, is unfolding something in which he, I don't like to use the word it, so I'm going to just say he delights. And that delight is that relationship between something that has been revealed and the one that helped generate it. I'm a Whiteheadian, I'm a process philosopher, and I believe that Whitehead's image, and he was an extraordinarily clever man with a deeply analytical mind as well as a syncretic mind. He saw that the cosmos and the divine ground of that cosmos were in a kind of fruitful dance together, in a relationship in which each came more and more into realizing what its potential was. And so I think that's very much at the core of Blake's insight. That's what I'd say. And Blake, of course, is wonderful for such insights.
And so that word tikkun, which you then use from the Judaic tradition, this notion of repair and the constant maintenance of the relationship that exists between us and whatever it is, that dance, that encounter is actually the creative process itself. It's in movement. It's not static. It's not fixed. It is the thing in movement and in flux and in flow. And that is
Yes.
what you're trying to honor, that all. Is that the correct way of reading that?
I think it absolutely is, yes. I love that whole story from the Lurianic Kabbalah of the shattering of the vessels and the repair of them. And I think it's a very beautiful one, both in terms of it speaks already as a metaphor or fable to us. But what's so special is that two things, that the vessels will be better and more beautiful once repaired than they were before they were shattered. Reminding me of that Japanese ceramic art kintsugi, in which a vessel is a broken one is repaired with lines of gold very often and becomes more beautiful. But the other thing that's so good about it is that in the Judaic tradition, it is our duty, our obligation, but also our honor to be the means for that repair. That is why we are here, to repair what was shattered. And I think that is something very rich and deep. We could talk about it for a long time, but I'm sure that listeners can see for themselves that it's a very important idea.
Well, Dr. McGilchrist, what a beautiful way to end on that call to repair. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I mean, really, truly, your book is, I think, the one that I have encountered in the last 10 years, really, of my whole thinking life, that I will engage with for the rest of my life. I think it is a treasure trove of experience, of vision, of heart, of love that is enduring and that gives so much. So I thank you so much for that work, for how it's helped me reorient my own way in trying to carve out these spaces to be sustained by that kind of reparative inspiration. So thank you so much for speaking with me and for that wonderful book.
Well, may I in turn thank you, Jack. I think it's enormously fulfilling for me to see my message being so well understood and so clearly received as it has been by you, and to hear that it's made a big difference to your life. That is really the only thing that can justify my writing. And thank you very much for responding in that way. And I would be very happy if in future, having read more and the world having unfolded more of what it has in store for us, whatever that may be, I would love to be able to join you again if you would like that.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGilchrist. I really am so grateful for that.